Breaking news today out of Russia, as it's being reported that Bashar Al-Assad has been poisoned, and the entire media is pointing the finger at Vladimir Putin. Everybody's suspecting Putin behind this act, because only Putin's friends have the habit of getting poisoned all of a sudden, if you know what I mean. Now, Putin considered Bashar as one of his closest friends until, of course, he had no use for him. As soon as Bashar's Syrian regime fell, Putin evacuated him to Moscow within hours. And the way the situation is emerging right now, it seems like Putin has discarded his closest friend. Putin is now cleaning up the trail of his wrongdoings in Syria. I don't know if you guys have followed or not, but Bashar has been living in Moscow for almost a month now, and it's been a month since he's been evacuated by Russian forces, but he still hasn't had a chance to meet with his closest friend, Vladimir Putin. Just this morning, we got the report that Bashar had been poisoned in his apartment. Lucky for him that he somehow survived this assassination attempt. In today's video, I'll tell you how this assassination attempt was exactly carried out and why people are pointing the finger at Putin. Now, one of the most interesting stories about Bashar fleeing from Syria is the fact that when he was fleeing in his last hours, what he did was contact Israeli agents. He gave them high-value targets in Syria to look at, and in return, he asked them not to shoot down his plane. Here's a little bit more detail on that story.
Syrian tyrant Bashar Al-Assad traded his country's military secrets with Israel in exchange for safe passage out of the country, it has been claimed. The murderous tyrant allegedly handed over coordinates for weapons depots, which Israel are now using to drop bombs on Syrian targets. A journalist from Turkish newspaper Hurriyet said a reliable source told him that Assad handed over a list with the locations of weapons depots, missile systems, and warplanes as a guarantee that Israel would not target him during his flight. Israel started dropping airstrikes on Syrian military strongholds soon after the fall of Assad's government, leading the reporter to claim that the traded list is likely true.
Bashar al-Assad has been lucky that he was able to leave Syria before the rebel forces got him, but things didn't exactly improve for him after reaching Moscow. Now, of course, we know about the poisoning, but before we uncover that part, you have to understand that Assad's family was kept under severe restrictions in Moscow. And, on top of that, he wasn't allowed to engage with news channels or post any comments on social media. He was totally cut off from the outside world as soon as he entered Russia. He couldn't even leave the city of Moscow. These kinds of restrictions just got too much for his wife. You have to know that Bashar's wife, Asma, is a UK citizen. She moved to Syria with Bashar to live a luxury life. So, after she lost that luxury, she realized that things are going to change, and she decided to file for divorce and asked the Russian courts to allow her to travel back to the UK. Now, despite being a UK citizen, their authorities informed her that she is not allowed to enter UK grounds, not even for her cancer treatment. So now the situation is that both the husband and wife are stuck in Moscow for an indefinite period of time. 8 days after leaving Syria, we actually got a statement from Bashar himself on his Telegram account. He shared his side of the story, shared with the public what exactly happened and why he fled the country. Here's more detail on that.
Bashar al-Assad says his sudden departure from Syria was unplanned and, he says, purportedly not his idea. The statement was posted to the Syrian presidency's account on Telegram, which has been disabled and then restored since the rebel takeover. In it, Assad purportedly says he stayed in Damascus, quote, carrying out his duties until the early hours of Sunday, December the 8th. Well, after rebels swept into the capital, the statement goes on to say he left the country until late that same day when Russia made the decision to evacuate him from its coastal airbase in Syria. Well, our international diplomatic editor, Nick Robertson, joining me now. Look, in this statement, Assad, and we have to assume it is him, but we are saying purportedly because we don't know for sure. But in it, he writes, quote, at no point during these events did I consider stepping down or seeking refuge. The only course of action was to continue fighting against the terrorist onslaught.
In the full statement, he mentions that he actually kept on fighting even after Damascus fell, and that he didn't want to leave Syria. He was forced to leave. In fact, it was Russia's decision, and they forced him to leave the country. If you read between the lines, I'm sure that's what he wanted to tell. His full statement is on your screen if you want to just pause and read the whole thing. After this statement, we didn't get to hear anything from Bashar himself, although we did hear from Putin talking about Assad, but we'll get to that later. Now let's uncover how Bashar got poisoned. Initially, the Kremlin tried to hide this news, but later it was leaked by a Russian account that is supposedly run by a former Russian spy. The report says that Bashar was admitted to the hospital in critical condition on Sunday. It further says that Bashar requested for medical help and then almost immediately began coughing violently and started choking as well. Now, the way the story is being told in the official statement, there's a reason to believe that it was an assassination attempt. The anonymous account claimed that Assad had been given treatment in his apartment and his condition stabilized on Monday. The test reports reportedly confirmed poison in his system, although no Russian media or officials gave any confirmation on that. Now, clearly this incident caught everyone by surprise, and many on Twitter instantly pointed their finger at Putin. First, we have someone saying, "It seems like they tried to kill Assad in Moscow. This is what happens when your most important friend is a scumbag." We have another reaction on Twitter saying, "So Putin trying to poison Bashar Assad in Moscow? Good idea. Bring him to Moscow with all Syrian money, poison him, and take the money. Every Russian ally deserves the same fate. If Bashar survives this time, it won't be for long." Lastly, we have a final reaction. Of course it's Putin who poisoned Bashar al-Assad. Putin is not a friend. He only uses you for his own benefit. Putin is a dirty rat, a scumbag. Now, we'd be here all night if I started showing you guys all the reactions on Twitter where people are blaming Putin for this assassination attempt, so let's move on. Now, another thing I want to point out here is that the KGB is super famous for killing individuals by putting poison in their food to make it look like a natural death. Now, since this incident happened in Russia, we would never know what type of poison was used to kill Assad. But since we know that poison was used in the attempt, I think it's pretty clear that the KGB was behind it. Another reason many people think Putin might have been involved in this is the fact that he still hasn't met Assad since he arrived in Moscow. Assad has been in his country for almost a month now, and he hasn't been able to get a meeting with Putin. I'm sure Assad has been pushing for that meeting badly, but Putin is ignoring him for his own reasons. Putin helped Assad stay in power for so long, even when there was civil unrest back in 2015, and Russia helped Assad to stay in power anyway. But this time around, Putin seems to have lost interest in Assad, which is why he's left him hanging like this. A few days back, in an interview, Putin was asked a question about Syria and Assad, and how Putin reacted was definitely very telling.
Mr. President, you have failed to reach the objectives of your special military operation. Large numbers of Russians have died, including a general assassinated here in Moscow this week. And the leader of Syria, who you supported, has been overthrown. Mr. President, when you face President-elect Trump, you will be the weaker leader. How do you propose to compromise? What are you going to offer?
You asked what we can offer, or I can offer to the President-elect Trump when we meet. I do not know when we are going to meet because he does not speak about that. I haven't spoken to him in more than 4 years now. You said that this conversation will take place where I'll be in a weakened state. Dear colleague, well, I'm saying dear and distinguished colleague, because though despite all persecutions of our media, the Russian media, you are allowed to work here, freely. Isn't that good already? To you and to the people who pay your salary in the United States would really like for Russia to be in a weakened state? I'm of a different opinion. I think that Russia became much stronger over the past 2 or 3 years. Why? Because we are becoming a truly sovereign country. And we barely depend on anybody. We are capable of firmly standing on our feet when it comes to the economy. I have already talked about economic growth rates. We are strengthening our defense capability. The combat readiness of the Russian armed forces is the highest in the world today. I assure you it is the highest. The same is true of our defense industry. We are increasing the production of everything our Army and Navy need now and will need in the future. We are doing so confidently and quickly, unlike our opponents. I have already spoken about the successes of our armed forces, which are due in large measure to production growth in the defense industry of the Russian Federation. As I have said, we are doing this confidently and quite rationally. It has been said that our forces are advancing along the front line. One explanation for this is the existence of the equipment I have mentioned. Yes, in fact, all NATO countries are fighting against us. We spoke about our inflation, and what is the situation over there? Take a 155mm shell, which cost 2,000 euros 2 years ago, and now costs 4 times more, 8,000 euros. If this trend persists, 2% of GDP spending on defense in NATO countries, which President-elect Donald Trump always insisted on, will not suffice. Even 3% will not be enough. The training and combat standards and the morale of the Russian armed forces are higher than those of any other army in the world. That is why I believe that Russia has largely achieved the state we wanted to achieve. It has grown stronger and become a truly sovereign state, and we will make decisions without looking at other people's opinions, only with our national interests in mind. You have mentioned Syria. You and, as I said, those who pay your salary would like to present the current developments in Syria as Russia's defeat. I assure you that this is not the case, and here is why. We came to Syria 10 years ago to prevent the creation of a terrorist enclave there, like the one that we saw in some other countries, for example, Afghanistan. We have achieved that goal, by and large. Even the groups that were fighting against the Assad regime and the government forces back then have undergone internal changes. It is not surprising that many European countries and the United States are trying to develop relations with them now. Would they be doing this if they were terrorist organizations? This means that they have changed, doesn't it? So our goal has been achieved to a certain degree. Next, we did not deploy any ground forces in Syria. They simply were not present there. Our presence consisted solely of 2 bases, an air base and a naval base. The ground operations were conducted by the Syrian armed forces and, as is widely known, there is no secret here, certain pro-Iranian combat units. At one point, we even withdrew our special operations forces from the area. We were not engaged in combat there. So what transpired? When armed opposition groups advanced towards Aleppo, the city was defended by approximately 30,000 personnel. However, when 350 militants entered the city, the government forces, along with the pro-Iranian units, withdrew without resistance, demolishing their positions as they left. This pattern was observed across nearly the entire Syrian territory.
Now, another thing that's at play here is that Putin is in talks with the Syrian rebels. The reason behind these talks is that Russia has invested billions and billions of dollars in the military bases in Syria, and Putin wants to save them any way possible. Now, this whole situation makes things even more complicated for Assad. Many analysts are claiming that if the talks between Putin and the Syrian rebels become successful, there's a chance that Putin will turn over Assad to the rebels just to save the bases. Basically, he would give up Assad to the rebels so they can prosecute him and bring him to justice for all the crimes he's committed throughout his regime. And in return, Russia will expect to keep all the bases they have in Syria. Now, these are just theories that all these analysts are making up. Nobody knows what Putin is thinking right now. But one thing is for sure, the Kremlin are negotiating with rebels, and that's definitely not a good sign for Bashar al-Assad.
Clearly, these documents will be very important should there be any kind of trial. But how hopeful are you, or how realistic is it that this will ever happen? And I know we've been here before many times with many other people accused of these kind of crimes. He's now in Russia, and it looks like he'll end his days there, really. So how likely is it that he will ever physically be brought to justice?
Well, if you'll permit me, I'll make 2 points. One concerning Assad and one concerning the many thousands of other perpetrators. So I'll start with the second group. The other perpetrators, as I've said earlier, have been prosecuted, and we're talking relatively small numbers, 10, 20, 30, over the last 10 years in various Western jurisdictions, domestic or national courts. As for Assad, I've been saying for some time, even before the regime fell, that the regime will fall. He will go to Moscow, Tehran, something like that. Ultimately, it's been Moscow. He is of no value to the Russians, not political, not material. And at some point, he will be a liability to them.
Right.
And they can throw him into some kind of a deal because Russia needs to rehabilitate itself or at least rebuild connections with the West. And I think he will become dispensable. I've said elsewhere that I have a bet with a former member of our board that this will happen not later than the 1st of January, 2028.
Right. I was going to ask you for a timescale, and you have delivered on that. 1st of January, 2028. That is very interesting indeed. About 3 years to go, you think, for Bashar al-Assad.